Today, Thursday, 18th January, we've had a fair amount of interesting political news from around the world, but I'm going to start firstly with the latest developments, military developments in Ukraine, because they're starting to take an interesting and perhaps dramatic turn. The first thing to say is that reports started to circulate yesterday that a group of Russian Marines had penetrated deep into the Ukrainian bridgehead on the east bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson region in Krynky, the village of Krynky, and had planted the Russian flag in the central part of the village. And there was further reports that other Russian forces, Russian paratroopers, were working together with the Marines, that there was a combined attack on Krynky, the Marines pressing in one direction, the paratroopers pressing in another direction, and that this small bridgehead is now in the process of total collapse. Now, I should say that there's been no actual photographic or visual confirmation of this. Some commentators, like Syriac, have come forward and said that this is all premature, that maybe the Russians have enlarged the grey zone within Krynky, but it is not necessarily the case that the entire bridgehead has collapsed. It could be that this story about the flag that has been planted in the center of Krynky is wrong. That's not what Syriac says, but that might be the implication of what he says. Anyway, there's been comments of that nature, basically comments trying to say, well, let's just wait, let's get further confirmation of what exactly is happening. And of course, as invariably happens, the Russian Defense Ministry preserves a sphinx-like silence. It doesn't tell us anything at all about what's happening in Krynky. It merely provides further updates of Ukrainian losses in the general Kherson direction without telling us much about the actual situation on the actual ground, who is advancing and who is retreating, and anything of that kind. However, there's been now a considerable accumulation of reports from various sources, and in aggregate, it does seem as if this bridgehead at Krynky is on the verge of final collapse. It may take some days. There are speculations that there are still Ukrainian soldiers clinging on to various parts of Krynky, hidden in basements and that kind of thing. Clearing the village, finally, of these fighters might take some time. But the accumulation of reports that's now building up, and it's coming from various sources, all appears to point to this battle for Krynky coming now to its end point. Now, this, of course, begs lots of questions. And what exactly has happened? What have the Ukrainians achieved as a result of the Battle of Krynky? And what are the future plans and prospects of the fighting in Kherson region? Now, I'm going to make a few observations of my own. I mean, I've been listening to what various people have been saying. I've been reading Reba, who has very little to say about all of this. Syriac, obviously. I've been paying attention to what Dima at the Military Summary channel has been saying. I'm going to say right away that I think this was a harebrained idea to try and advance across the Dnieper River into Kherson region. I don't know who it was who came up with it. I strongly suspect, however, that it is a product of a discussion that General Zaluzhny had with the British and American chiefs of staff, Mark Milley and Admiral Radakin, way back in the summer when it was already clear that the Ukrainian offensive towards, in Zaporozhye region, the attempt to capture Tokmak and break through to the Sea of Azov, that was failing. And I remember that there was a lot of talk then about rebooting the Ukrainian offensive, and I suspect that the idea of this attack across the Dnieper into Kherson region came out of all of that. This was around the time when Ukraine abandoned its attempt to advance towards Mariupol through the Vremev Salient. They'd had enormous trouble trying to capture those two villages, Staromayorsk and Urozhaine, back in August. They claim to have captured both of those villages. There are Ukrainian troops apparently in those villages, but Ukrainian control of the villages has been very tenuous, and they've never really been able to advance beyond them. So that particular attack was called off. The Marines, the Ukrainian Marines, the 4 Marine brigades that had been leading the assault in the Vremev salient area, were redeployed to Kherson region, and the attempt was made to try to establish a bridgehead in Kherson region east of the Dnieper as part of this attempt to reboot Ukraine's offensive. And I remember that all sorts of grandiose titles were given to various Ukrainian military groups at that time. Omaha, one group was called Omaha, another was called Normandy. It was all attempts to recreate the legend, if you like, of the Normandy landings carried out by the British and the Americans in 1944, which again suggests to me an Anglo-American trace, origin point to this particular scheme. Anyway, it was never viable. Brian Beletic at the New Atlas has on many occasions explained why. There are layers of Russian fortified lines between the Dnieper and Crimea in this area. It's one of the most heavily fortified parts of the front lines because obviously the Russians had always anticipated an offensive, an attempted Ukrainian offensive across the Dnieper. In fact, I can actually remember Putin at one point coming forward and saying that the desired plan, the desired plan by the Ukrainians as far as the Russians were concerned was precisely an attempt by Ukraine to try and advance across the Dnieper. This was seen by the Russians as even more likely to fail than an advance towards the Sea of Azov via Tokmak from Zaporozhye region. So this was never going to succeed. And as Brian Beletic has pointed out, it was in effect the same plan to try and break through the Russian fortified lines, which failed in Zaporozhye region, except, of course, that a major river, the Dnieper, was there lying between the fortifications and the Ukrainians' logistic bases, a river which would always have been presented a major problem for Ukraine's logistics supply to its advanced troops. And I remember that Saldo, the Russian governor of Kherson region, actually way back, I think it was in November, gave what he set out as the timeline that the Ukrainians had presumed when they launched this attack across the Dnieper. And I don't recall all the exact details, but as I seem to remember, he thought that the Ukrainians had been looking to capture Novaya Kakhovka on the east bank of the Dnieper. This is a small town where the Kakhovka Dam used to be, that they planned to capture Novaya Kakhovka by the end of November and reach the administrative capital of Russian-controlled Kherson region on the sea, on the Black Sea, Genishek, by the middle of December. So this is apparently, according to the Russians, the original Ukrainian plan. Well, it failed right from the outset. The Ukrainians got bottled up in this small little bridgehead in Krynky. The Russians kept it going for a few months. They allowed the Ukrainians essentially to remain there. They bombed and shelled it relentlessly. They created a fire sack out of it. There are now more and more photos coming from this bridgehead showing that it has been reduced to a shattered lunar landscape. As I said, it looks like the old pictures from Passchendaele from the First World War that you can find in British history books. And there were accumulating complaints from Ukrainian soldiers, appearing even in Western newspapers, with the soldiers complaining that when they were sent to Krynky, in most cases they were being sent to their death, that there was no real prospect of advancing beyond Krynky, and that they couldn't understand why they were being sent there. And the reason they were being sent there is because the Ukrainians, President Zelensky, despite the almost immediate failure of this offensive across the Dnieper River, nonetheless still wanted to cling on to the illusion that an offensive towards Crimea from the Dnieper would still be possible. And we've had multiple reports about this, that in the summer or some point in the next few months there would be a major Ukrainian advance, more amphibious landings, more advances across the Dnieper, and that the Ukrainians would reach Crimea and they would use their long-range missiles to win the battle of Crimea, and that this would be the pathway for Ukraine's victory. And I pointed out my utter skepticism of this fantastic plan, and the person again who has analyzed it and deconstructed it most effectively is Brian Belletic, who has discussed it all in the new Atlas on his video channel extremely well. By the way, on that topic, I should say that Brian Belletic has also done an article, interesting article, which discusses the complete fallacy of the whole idea that Ukraine can somehow isolate Crimea, even if they were to get to the administrative boundaries of Crimea. Crimea, of course, itself is very, very heavily fortified. Even if Ukraine could sever the land bridge and destroy the Kerch Bridge, there are far too many ports and air links linking Crimea to Russia for the Russians to feel under any pressure to abandon it. The idea that Ukraine can launch hundreds of missiles against these ports and force these ports to close is a fallacy. The Russians have successfully intercepted and shot down most of these missiles anyway, and there just aren't enough missiles in the West to keep all of these ports closed simultaneously. This is an operation that simply cannot succeed. But it is the concept, the conception that Zelensky and all sorts of American generals and ex-generals and British generals and ex-generals and perhaps admirals all came up with. They were already talking about it in the spring and the summer. I've been reading article after article about how reaching Crimea was the key to victory. And, well, Ukraine shattered its ground army in the summer offensive, trying to achieve this mirage of isolating Crimea, and it has now shattered its 4 Marine brigades, 4 of its elite brigades, trying to do the same thing. Now, Dima at the Military Summary Channel estimates Ukrainian losses in the Krynky operation. This is an estimate, it is not confirmed, but he estimates it at around 6,000 men. And that seems to me reasonable. And we're talking about 4 brigades. That is the equivalent of one of these brigades. But of course, spread out amongst all of them. And of course, they must, if this operation really now is being called off, they must be coming away, these men in these brigades, they must be coming away embittered and angry and deeply demoralized about what has happened. And whilst I'm not suggesting that these brigades cannot be reconstituted and thrown again into the battle, the men who make them up are going to become increasingly cynical and concerned about their own lives rather than ready to sacrifice their lives for the cause in order to achieve victory, or so at least I would have thought. And of course, the Battle of Krynky has given the Russians huge opportunities to inflict enormous material damage upon the Ukrainians, well beyond the losses in men. I mean, there's been endless numbers of pictures of Ukrainian artillery pieces being destroyed by Lancet drones on the west bank of the Dnieper. The Russians have had ample opportunities to bomb with their heavy Fab 500 and Fab 1500 precision-guided glide bombs, Ukrainian formations and command positions on the west bank of the Dnieper. Dima at the Military Summary Channel has pointed out that it's likely that quite a lot of Ukrainian FPV drone operators have been killed as well. They would have had to be located close to the river's edge because of the distance to Krynky, and that would have exposed them to Russian attacks. Overall, this was an ill-thought-out, profoundly misconceived, and disastrous debacle. And Dima spends a great deal of time analysing, discussing why it rather looks as if this bridgehead might be in the process of collapsing now. I should say that might be a little premature because we don't know for a fact that this is what is happening, though, as I said, I would be surprised if it were not. But points out that, the ice on the rivers, not just the Dnieper, but on the small tributary rivers, has now made supply to the Ukrainian forces in Krynky incredibly difficult. The very low temperatures have made the conditions of the Ukrainian troops trying to hold out in Krynky all but unbearable. And he's speculating that some of the troops have used the opportunity of the icing up of some of the tributaries, the smaller tributaries and channels, to escape probably to the surrounding islands in order to avoid being caught up much longer in this hell. I don't know that is the case. I think we need to have much more information. I suspect that the reality is, anyway, that by now there are not that many Ukrainian troops left in Krynky. Perhaps 100 or 200 at most of them probably very tired and very ill, and who knows whether in fact there has been even a retreat in Krynky. It might just be the case that the Ukrainian soldiers there are no longer in a position to keep resisting and keep fighting. And if the Russians are indeed at the center of Krynky and raising flags there, that could simply be because Ukrainian resistance, the will to resist, has simply collapsed. Anyway, there we are. A lot about Krynky, an interesting battle. Dima again speculates that having won the Battle of Krynky, the Russians will redeploy all their forces to other places. They might do that, but I think let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. I'm not going to try and play general and discuss these things because I don't know. I mean, it's way beyond my area of expertise. But other things have been going on the battlefronts as well, and they are cumulatively bad news for Ukraine. The first thing that I would say is that the Russian Defense Ministry has now confirmed formally that of which there is now photographic and film evidence, which is that Kamov 52 helicopter gunships are back in operation on the battlefronts. And there's a short report about this. It says, and it includes a brief film on the Russian Defense Ministry website. It says Kamov 52 Alligator helicopter crew wipes out Ukrainian hardware and manpower in the Svatovo-Kremenaya direction. There's a lot of speculation as to why, beyond a certain point, the Kamov 52s disappeared from the battlefield and why they've now suddenly reappeared. They stopped operating in large numbers. As I remember, sometime in late August or September, there was speculation that several Kamov 52s were destroyed in an ATACMS missile strike on a Russian airbase in Berdyansk, which might have been true. My guess is simply that having been very, very heavily used in the early period of Ukraine's summer offensive, when the Kamov 52s proved absolutely effective, tremendously effective against Ukrainian armor, I suspect that after weeks of intense operations, the Russian Defense Ministry decided that these people had done their job and it was time to give them a rest. And probably that is what has happened. Probably more Kamov 52s have been produced and have replaced the losses. Probably more pirate pilots have been trained, and the moment has therefore come to recommit them for use on the front lines. So that. And the Russian Defense Ministry, I said, it's very Sphinx-like in discussing what is going on the battlefronts, but it has now provided a very brief and rather uninformative report about the fighting near Bakhmut. Remember, Bakhmut, the Russians refer to as Artyomovsk. And it says that Russian paratroopers capture Ukrainian stronghold to northwest of Artyomovsk, and paratrooper assault detachments of the U group of forces continue to improve the situation along the forward line and, supported by artillery, captured a Ukrainian stronghold northwest of Artyomovsk. During air reconnaissance of Ukrainian positions, the paratroopers located main firing positions and shelters along with an infantry cluster. The airborne troops' artillery delivered the strikes. Then the paratroopers approached the Ukrainian positions on BMD-2 airborne assault vehicles, captured the Ukrainian positions, and eliminated the enemy. Now, that looks to me like a rather elliptical way of confirming Russian progress in the Bogdanovka, Popovka forest area, northwest of Bakhmut. It could be that over the next couple of days, we'll be getting a cascade more news about this. Again, in one of his recent programs, Dima at the Military Summary Channel and others were saying that there'd been a Russian advance. Russian paratroopers had launched a major advance in the northwest area of Bakhmut, in and around Bogdanovka, pushing on towards Chasiv Yar. And this report from the Russian Defense Ministry suggests that the Russian Defense Ministry assesses the situation as going well, and they might be preparing the ground for an announcement of good news further on. But there has been other things going on in other places. Firstly, we've seen many more pictures now of intense Russian bombing and shelling of Avdiivka itself. This is, the main area of the Russian attack, or so it seems to me. Bakhmut and Avdiivka, I suspect, is where the most intense fighting has been going on recently. Anyway, the Russians are now bombing Avdiivka relentlessly. Sukhoi 25 fighter bombers are operating over the town. Lots of pictures of them. Apparently, helicopter gunships are also busy attacking positions in Avdiivka. There's very heavy shelling of Avdiivka also going on, and there's been dribbles of reports of more Russian attacks in places like Pervomaysky, the village to the northwest, to the southwest rather, of Avdiivka, and of the Russians consolidating their gains in Stepovoye to the northwest of Avdiivka, and perhaps also in the immediate suburbs of Avdiivka to the north, and also perhaps the Russians pushing further up in along the railway, both towards Ocheritenye, but also to the west and perhaps even the east of the railway, gradually folding up Ukrainian positions. Anyway, this very heavy bombing and shelling of Avdiivka may point to a Russian assault on Ukrainian positions in Avdiivka itself. It's important to remember that Avdiivka is a largish place, around 30,000 people before the war. But if the pattern of previous battles of Mariupol and Severodonetsk and Lysychansk and Bakhmut are going to be followed, the Russians tend to try and interrupt the supply lines and then clear these places block by block. And it could be that the Russians feel that the supply lines into Avdiivka are now becoming so tenuous that it's time to prepare for an actual ground operation in the town itself. Well, we shall see. Anyway, there's also been other news and some conflicting reports about what is happening north of Bakhmut and indeed north of the big suburb of Bakhmut, which is Soledar, administratively a separate town in itself, both captured, by the way, by the Wagner organization at the start of 2023. Anyway, there's reports that the Russians are pushing north Some reports say that the Russians are in the process of surrounding a village to the north of these places, a village called Veseloye. But there are other reports, still other reports, from Riba, for example, that the Russians have actually managed to capture this village, that this village is now actually under Russian control. And this is a small village, but it's apparently on a hill, and it is a strategic location. And there is some suggestions that this village is either in the process of capture or has in fact already been captured. And we're told that this is from Riba now, Veseloye, to give it its proper name, south of Siversk, we'll come to Siversk in a moment, has been captured. And Riba usually is conservative about making these reports. So if they're saying that Veseloye has been captured, more likely than not it has been, though so far Riba is the only source that I know of to actually say that. But anyway, Riba says that Veseloye has been captured and that it is quite possible that the Russians will reach the southern outskirts of Siversk in the first quarter of 2024. And then there is a slightly tetchy video from the head of Riba, a Russian journalist called Mikhail Zvinchuk. He says that, in his opinion, the Russians made a major mistake in the summer of 2022 by failing to capture Siversk. That the fact that they didn't capture Siversk in the summer of 2022 meant that Russian positions in the northern Donbass were not anchored properly, that there was opportunities to capture Siversk after the capture by the Russians of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in the summer of 2022, that the fact that Siversk was not seized explains why the Russians have had many problems in northern Donbass ever since. And though he doesn't quite say it, I suspect that he probably thinks, as by the way I do, that it was the failure to capture Siversk which made the entire Russian position in Kharkiv region in the summer of 2022 very precarious, and which exposed the Russians to the need to retreat when the Ukrainians launched their own counteroffensive in the Kharkiv area in September 2022, capturing in quick succession the towns of Balakleya, Izium, Kupiansk, and eventually Liman. Now, I've actually, by the way, explained why I think the Russians failed to capture Siversk in the summer of 2022. In my opinion, two things happened. Firstly, the Russian forces in Ukraine became depleted when the 6-month contract period for Russian soldiers expired, professional soldiers expired, and many of them chose to return to civilian life. They were all then called up again later as reservists and brought back into their regiments in the autumn. But anyway, in the summer, there was a sudden reduction in the size of the Russian army, and also the intense political pressure from Donetsk, from the Donetsk regional government to push the Ukrainian forces away from Donetsk caused the Russians to divert forces away from Lugansk region and from the Siversk area south towards Donetsk itself, so that there was this attack on the village of Pesky and the first advances towards Bakhmut, which were given priority over the capture of Siversk. I've said already that I also, with hindsight, think that might have been a mistake. But, of course, war is always a complex matter. It involves political as well as military decisions. At that time, the Donbass militia was independent of the Russian military, and I think that politically speaking, the Russian leadership simply was not in a position to disregard their feelings. Anyway, there we go. Rybar now thinks that there is a chance that Siversk might be at least reached sometime over the next couple of weeks. And of course, if it is eventually captured, then that will be a major change of the situation on the northern front lines. And lastly, I should say there's been lots of reports pointing to further Russian advances further south in the Marinka area, pushing on through Georgievka towards Kurakovo, and also a steady incremental encirclement of Novomikhailovka, this village to the south of Marinka, which the Russians clearly are aiming to capture. So, all of these Russian advances, all of them happening in this winter. And to reiterate, my own view is that though the Russians continue to speak about active defense, I prefer the expression aggressive attrition to describe what they're doing, because I don't think that this is exactly a defensive operation that the Russians are conducting, but I don't think it is a simple offensive either. I think the Russians are continuing to exert pressure on the Ukrainians all along the front line in order to weaken the Ukrainians, to deplete their forces. Shoigu has recently talked about this. Hanna Maliar from the Ukrainian side has in effect confirmed it. And I think that the Russians do have objectives to capture at least some places. Definitely, I think they're aiming eventually to gain control of Avdiivka itself. All of the signs point to that. Probably they are aiming to take eventually Chasiv Yar and perhaps Siversk, if what Rybar tells us is true, and conceivably Kupiansk as well. In fact, I think more likely than not, they will want to take at least the part of Kupiansk, which is east of the Oskol River. There are lots of reports now that the Russians are seeking to regain full control of Rabotino in the Zaporozhye region, though I doubt that this is given very, very much priority. And anyway, I think that as well as conducting attrition, the Russians are indeed looking to gain valuable ground, maybe not achieve breakthroughs, but deplete the Ukrainian forces and significantly improve their positions on the battlefield in advance of whatever larger offensive the Russians might be planning later this year. So that's my own view about what it is that the Russians are doing, and it is why I prefer the expression aggressive attrition to active defense. By the way, on that topic, the Moon of Alabama has got a rather interesting little piece which cites the Institute for the Study of War. The Institute of the Study of War is very cross because Shoigu is talking about active defense. They're saying that Russian Defense Minister Shoigu continues to falsely characterize Russian offensive efforts in Ukraine as part of an active defense in order in an effort to temper expectations about the Russian military's ability to achieve operationally significant objectives. Well, what is wrong with that? Why is that anything to be critical of? Why is it wrong for the Russians to temper expectations, to keep expectations within bounds, even as they conduct their policy of aggressive attrition? I mean, it does seem to me a rather spluttering point made by the Institute for the Study of War back in December, as I understand. But, I mean, why wouldn't Shoigu downplay what the Russian forces are achieving? Surely the mistake the Western powers and the Ukrainians made last year was, on the contrary, to make repeated claims that their summer offensive would be an extraordinary triumph, which of course boxed them into something that turned out for them to be a disaster. Anyway, just saying, I'm not going to waste more time on that. So there we go, a battle continuing in Ukraine, and on the ground at least, the Russians certainly now appearing to be making significant progress since they resumed their active operations after the Christmas lull. Now, there have been some more reports about the situation in the air, and the Russians have now made a very, very extraordinary claim. They mentioned that they struck at a hotel building in Kharkiv some days ago. In fact, I discussed it, as I remember, in one of my videos just a few days ago. But importantly, they are now saying that the hotel housed something like 200, or perhaps more than that, French mercenaries, and that these mercenaries were killed in, well, 200 of them were killed or perhaps severely wounded. And this could be true. There is photographic evidence. A person who has been providing me with a huge amount of assistance in over the course of the last year, and who has been consistently accurate in the information he has provided, has actually provided me with actual third-party evidence which appears to confirm that that Ukraine houses mercenaries in these hotels. But I wonder whether there's actually more to the story than even the Russians are saying. Because the same source has said that significant parts of Ukraine's air defense system uses Western operators drawn from Western countries, not serving military as I understand, but people who have presumably done this sort of thing before and have now been given contracts and are now serving in military operations. And as I have discussed, the Russians do seem to be making a major effort to strike at the air defense system, Ukraine's air defense system. And I wonder whether some of these mercenaries, and we're told that they're all French, were in fact people who have been used by France, who have been sent by France, specifically France, to try to keep the French supplied air defense system, the French-Italian air defense system, the one based on the, I think it's the Aster missile, whether the purpose was some of these people may have been some of the operators of the French Aster system. I believe there are 2 such systems in Ukraine. Now, it might be questionable what they were doing in Kharkiv, which is a frontline city, but perhaps they are there to provide air defense for Kharkiv at a time when the Ukrainians have been trying to launch strikes on Belgorod, just over the border. Just saying. Anyway, this is all speculation, and I'm not going to dwell on it further. The Russians are making this claim, and there does seem to be some reason to think that it might actually be true. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefronts. Now, there have been some really interesting things going on the diplomatic front. The first is that there's been a farcical incident in Davos between President Zelensky and the Chinese Prime Minister Li Qian. Now, Li Qian has come to Davos to attend the WEF forum, and he's brought with him a very strong Chinese delegation. And, well, this is a topic to discuss on another day. But President Zelensky, who is indeed in Davos, apparently asked to meet Li Qian, and Li Qian said no. So Zelensky, apparently irritated, or presumably irritated, by this refusal by Li Qian, actually said that he hadn't really wanted to meet Li Qian after all, because Li Qian is far below him in protocol terms. He's only the Prime Minister of China. The only person that Zelensky considers worthy of his attention, worthy of a meeting, is the President of China, Xi Jinping, who, of course, is not currently in Davos. Now, I have to say, this is not going to go down well with the Chinese or with Prime Minister Li Qian. I mean, it is unbelievably and pointlessly insulting. So, I mean, this whole grotesque incident, again, provides a further illustration of just how maladroit a diplomat Zelensky is, and why it might be in the interests of the Western powers, as they try to drum up support for Ukraine, to try to keep him bottled up in Kiev rather than have people meet with him. Whenever it happens, it is a disaster. It was a disaster when Zelensky met with the Arab League leaders, as I well remember. It was a disaster in Tokyo when he didn't meet President Lula and managed to offend Prime Minister Modi. And it has just proved to be a disaster again in Davos when he didn't meet Prime Minister Li Qian and insulted him instead. So that is a pretty grotesque incident. But there has been, on the American side, some indications that the neocons have been busy trying to, if not drum up continued support for Ukraine, though they are trying to do that, at least block off the possibility of negotiations to find some way to bring this conflict to an end. And there's been a very good article by James Carden. I should say that I know of this article because it was in a link provided, one of the articles for which links were provided by Jeff Roberts, the British historian, who tracks down articles like this um, and found this one. But anyway, going to this article, which, as I said, I'm grateful to Jeff Roberts for bringing to my attention. Just look at this. Look at the articles that have appeared since the beginning of January in the American media. So on the 10th of January, the Wall Street Journal published an article explaining why the Ukrainian offensive of the summer failed. It's always failed. It's never defeated. And there's a quote: "The biggest problem may be that Ukraine is insufficiently armed to penetrate Russian defenses." The implication is that Ukraine must be better armed. And in fact, we get a quote: "Ukraine's top military officer," in other words, Zaluzhny, says Ukraine needs better technology to defeat an enemy with a population more than 3 times larger. So Ukraine needs more weapons. If it gets those weapons, the implication is it can win. So that was the Wall Street Journal on the 10th of January. And then 2 days before, on the 8th of January, an article in Foreign Policy that talks about the fact that Ukraine might still have a pathway to victory. And the current conventional wisdom in large parts of the West is that Ukraine is losing the ground war, but, surprise, surprise, more and better weapons along with US and European assistance to work with the Ukrainians on how to better manage operational complexity and combine technology, information and tactics in more dynamic ways would return movement to the now static battlefield and give Ukraine a fighting chance. So that was foreign policy on the 8th of January. And simultaneously, on the very same day, 8th of January, an article in the New Yorker: "What could tip the balance in the war in Ukraine?" And surprise, surprise, same thing. "If Western backers provide necessary arms, training and financing to Ukraine, its military may emerge by next year with the upper hand." And then on the 3rd of January, another article, this time in Foreign Affairs: "The war in Ukraine is not a stalemate, and victory apparently hinges on the willingness of the West to continue to fund the war effort. Support Ukraine so that its leaders can defend their territory and prepare for a 2025 offensive." And we're told that the alternative is to cede the advantage to Russia. So it's really entirely up to us. Ukraine can still win. It's all entirely up to us. If we give the Ukrainians all the weapons they need and all the money they need, they can still win. If the Ukrainians lose, it'll be our fault because we didn't give them all the things that they needed. And then this is also, as James Carden points out, the theme of a long piece in the Washington Post by Max Boot, neocon, very public and very active neocon for many years. And he also is basically saying that what Ukraine needs is more money and more weapons. The implication is that if Ukraine gets this money and weapons, it can somehow succeed. And if it doesn't and loses, then it will again be the fault of the West. The people who failed to give the Ukrainians more money and more weapons, they will have lots of Ukrainian blood on their hands. And then in the Washington Post, on the 10th of January, directly after Max Boot's article, Lee Hochstadter writes another piece: "It is indisputable that the West could and should have done more, faster, to prepare Kiev for its month-long counter-offensive that began last June. Instead, the West dithered, and Ukraine's push petered out as fall turned to winter. So again, it all depends on us. Our hesitations and vacillations have, according to Hochstadter, signaled the West's weakness to the Russian tyrant. More than sending any missile to Ukraine is the surest provocation and the real danger. So give Ukraine more weapons, give them longer range weapons, help them to launch deep strikes far into Russia itself. That isn't dangerous. Standing by, letting Ukraine be defeated, that is much more dangerous because it signals weakness to the Russian tyrant. Anyway, there we go. Now, when we get a whole cluster of articles like this, all appearing at one and the same time, and all essentially telling us the same thing, then that has, at least to me, very much the look of an orchestrated campaign. There's been much talk recently about negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, between the West and Russia, and it looks to me as if the neocons in Washington, who, bear in mind, they're all mixed, they all talk to each other, they are very active in each other's think tanks. Anyway, it looks to me as if they've been rushing out articles, one after the other, over a very short time frame. The earliest one of these articles that I've spoken about appeared on the 10th of January. Rather, I should correct that, James Carden spoke about. So it appeared on the 10th of January, and the last one appeared on the 10th of January. So over a 7-day period, a cluster of articles all saying exactly the same thing. Let's not negotiate. Victory is still possible. Let's give Ukraine more of everything, more money, more weapons. We can still turn this round. If we failed in the summer, this was not because the strategy of giving Ukrainians weapons and money was wrong. It was because we didn't do enough of it. If we'd done more, if we'd given them fighter jets and long-range missiles, if we'd enabled the Ukrainians to strike at Moscow itself with long-range missiles, presumably, well, that would have delivered Ukraine victory and achieved all the extreme objectives that we set ourselves right at the start of the war, regime change in Moscow, and all of that. And it is our fault that it didn't happen. Now, notice that all of these articles reduce it to a question of will. They don't ask basic questions. Are aircraft, are pilots available in sufficient numbers? Were there perhaps good reasons why a decision was made before not to supply fighter jets to Ukraine? Maybe the Russian air defense system is too sophisticated. Maybe the Russian Air Force is too large. Maybe the Russians have too many pilots. Is it actually possible for the West to supply weapons? We've discussed in many programs the massive problems with artillery shell production, of which the West is now desperately short, and Ukraine is desperately short. There's a bitter article by Con Coughlin in the Daily Telegraph today, lamenting the dire state of Britain's armed forces, the fact that the British cannot deploy their 2 aircraft carriers, their 2 Queen Elizabeth II class aircraft carriers to the Gulf of Aden because there are barely any aircraft flying on them, so that they are essentially unusable as aircraft carriers. Anyway, none of all of this, none of the limits in terms of weapon systems, of manufacturing capabilities, or of logistics, none of that enters into neocon calculations at all. They brush all of that aside. They completely ignore it. They also, of course, completely ignore what the Russians might potentially do. Now, again, that same source that I've been talking about over the course of this program, he pointed out that the Russian missile offensive last winter, which, as I said, in my opinion, was primarily targeting not the energy system as such, but the air defense system, Ukraine's air defense system. But he's also pointed out, and he's provided all kinds of evidence to support this, that one of its other purposes, in fact, a very important purpose, was to slow down the build-up of Ukrainian reserves and to temper Ukraine's offensive capability over the course of the winter. At that time, Ukrainian forces outnumbered Russian by around 2-1 on the battlefronts. So launching missile strikes, especially in the late autumn of 2022, knocking out the energy system, interrupting the movement of trains across Ukraine, made it impossible for Ukraine to press forward with offensives after the offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson, which gave more time for the Russians to build up their fortifications, their fortified lines, and to increase the size of their military. That's just one example of how the Russians could respond to anything that the Ukrainians do or that the Western powers do in order to help the Ukrainians to do it. But again, the neocons, this isn't something they really notice. Always with them, it comes down to a simple question of will. They take it as axiomatic that the means to achieve any objectives that they set, however far-fetched and grandiose that objective might be, the pacification of Iraq, the pacification of Afghanistan, the overthrow of the government of Iran, the regime change in Moscow, all of that is within the power of the West and specifically of the United States to do. Arguing against that is heresy. If these things are attempted and don't happen, that is not because the means to do them don't exist. It is because there is an insufficiency of will. And it is the same with these further proposals. You can't negotiate with the Russians. You can't negotiate with Lucifer himself. That really is absolutely unacceptable. It is inconceivable. It is a betrayal. It is treachery. In Max Boot's words, it's like having lots of Ukrainian blood on your hands. That's what he says about the Republicans in Congress who are reluctant to provide funding for Ukraine. It signals hesitations and vacillations and weakness to the Russian tyrant. You can still win. All you need is to have the will in order to do it. And this is the creed. This is the neocon creed, and we see it coming back into action. Now, the point is that this is magical thinking, to take that article from the Wall Street Journal, on steroids. But it is magical thinking that continues to exert an extraordinary and dangerous amount of power. It makes any kind of negotiation all but impossible, because anybody within the US government or any European government who wants or thinks of negotiations is going to find it almost impossible to argue with arguments like this. If everything is reduced to a question of will, then arguing about logistics, infrastructure, industrial capacity, funding, all of that. Well, that's not going to convince these people. It's simply going to prove to them that you don't have the necessary will. Now, fortunately for these people, Sergei Lavrov has given a massive news conference. It's lasted about 3 hours. I haven't had time to digest it all, and as is always the case, the foreign ministry in Moscow is slow with its translation. But anyway, Lavrov has made it quite clear that the West is not to be trusted, and that is going to affect the way in which negotiations are conducted from this point on. And this is from TASS, and it's their main story, by the way, that he said this. This main story this morning. He said, any illusions, if some still remain since the 1990s, that the West has now opened its arms to us and that democracy will unite us all these illusions have finally vanished. The West is not trustworthy. Those are Lavrov's words. And that also makes it very difficult to see how a negotiation could take place. The Russians mistrust the West. The neocons see any negotiations as a sign of flagging will and weakness. And between them, this makes it all but inconceivable that negotiations can happen. But for further examples of what magical thinking does, I would just now finish by going to certain articles which are appearing in the Financial Times. Now, I should say that these are about the situation in Germany, and that there are some people who are becoming increasingly realistic about the situation in Ukraine is now confirmed by a vote that has just happened in the Bundestag. Now, this was concerning the supply of Taurus missiles to Ukraine. And various politicians, political leaders in Germany have been advocating the supply of Taurus long-range missiles to Ukraine. Long-range missiles that could, in theory, strike at Russian territory. When I say Russian territory, I mean territory that was Russian before 2014. And the resolution failed. There was a clear majority, in fact, a large majority of German MPs who voted against this proposal. There were certain very strong comments from some MPs saying that this whole idea was dangerous and misconceived. I have to say, it was a debate which finally made me feel that some sanity is at last returning to German policy, which is sorely needed in terms of the disaster the German policy over the Ukraine crisis has been up to now. But the Financial Times article is not about that. It is about the farmers' strikes in Germany, the farmers' protests. And by the way, it isn't just farmers in Germany who are protesting. Farmers in the Netherlands are protesting as well. And there's farmers in Poland have been protesting for a long time. And now, by the way, there's a blockade of the Ukrainian border in Romania as well. And what has triggered the latest farm protests is that the German government, as a result of the budget crisis it now finds itself in, has had to cut subsidies for agricultural diesel to German farmers. They're now furious about this. They're protesting. A group of about 300 of them heckled Robert Habeck, the Vice Chancellor and Economics Minister, and de facto head of the Greens as he was coming back from holiday, something which apparently caused massive shock to the German political establishment. German politicians apparently are not used to being treated in this way. Christian Lindner, the foreign finance minister, was also heckled and abused when he tried to speak to the farmers about his reasons for doing this. And the farmers appear to have very high support within German society. There's been opinion polls in Germany which apparently show that the great majority of people in Germany, or at least a significant majority of people in Germany, despite all the protests, despite all the disruption, they sympathise with the farmers. A Forza poll, this is from the Financial Times, found 81% of voters sympathise with the protests, 66% think the diesel subsidy should be reinstated, and INSA poll, INSA poll, found 45% of Germans could imagine following the farmers and taking to the streets against the government, whose support, by the way, is collapsing. Now, if you know anything about Germany, when 45% of Germans tell you in an opinion poll that they might be willing to protest, that is a pretty astonishing number. I'm not saying they will, mind. But then the Financial Times has to ask, how is it that it came about? And of course, the reality is that it's come about as a product of the economic war between Germany and Russia. The Germans cut themselves off from cheap Russian gas, and indeed, by the way, also cheap Russian oil and coal. This has undermined the competitiveness of German industry. No less a person than Robert Habeck, the economics minister, the head of the Green Party, the vice chancellor, a person who was passionately supportive of all of these sanctions, as I remember. Anyway, he's now come forward and has actually admitted that it's the loss of all of this cheap Russian energy that is now affecting German competitiveness. He's actually admitted it in a debate in the Bundestag. Anyway, it's Germany's decision to engage Russia in this economic war, which is clearly responsible if the coalition is disintegrating. And the article in the Financial Times is titled, "Fractious German Coalition Lurches from Crisis to Crisis." If the AfD is rising in the opinion polls, if Sarah Wagenknecht's new party might also become a political challenge, it's not difficult to see why. It's because, as I said, Germany opted for this economic war and took the decision to cut itself off from Russian energy. But the Financial Times won't admit it. This is what they say. Scholz and his ministers are not solely to blame for Germany's predicament. Soaring energy costs, record inflation, and high interest rates were part of the fallout from Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which forced the country to break its addiction to cheap Russian gas. So it's not decisions. It's not choosing. It's not Germany deciding to put its interests first, to say, look, we oppose what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, but we have our own interests and our own people and our own industries and our own economies to think about. It's not decisions. This is, well, it's not even an act of God. It's an act of Vladimir Putin. His decision to launch the special military operation caused the crisis in Germany. It forced Germany to break its addiction to cheap Russian gas. This is, again, an astonishing abdication. There was a famous statement once made back in the 50s by a French Prime Minister, Pierre Mendès France, way back long ago, in which he said that to govern is to choose. But apparently in the West now, making choices, choosing, making decisions, that's not what government is all about. You must instead follow the line. If you don't, it's a sign that you lack will. You're appeasing the tyrant in the Kremlin. You are signaling weakness. And if it means destroying your government, destabilizing your country, causing people to come out and protest in their thousands, causing blockages in your streets, well, it's a sign of strength, apparently, that you're prepared to take on all of that. Well, I think this is absurd. I don't think this is what government is about. I think that governments need to start doing what they are elected to do, which is govern. Government involves making choices. The real important hard choices at the moment are to start negotiations. In Germany, this is becoming imperative. In Britain, it is also imperative as well. We've done a program on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I, about the malaise in Britain. But of course, it's not going to happen because the concept of governments making choices, of making decisions, of assessing what they decide to do based on the actual realities, the economic factors in Germany's case, the logistical and industrial and infrastructure factors in America's case when it comes to supporting Ukraine, well, that supposedly is not allowed. Well, this is where I'm going to end my program today. There's a lot going on in the Middle East as well. Iran has launched missile strikes in Pakistan. Pakistan has countered by launching missile strikes in Iran. Both countries are going out of their way to say that this was not an unfriendly action against the other. This was purely intended to attack terrorists operating in each country in this wild and uncontrolled area of Baluchistan against the other. Of course, the reality is otherwise. Note that Iran did not consult Pakistan before it launched its strikes, and Pakistan did not consult Iran when it launched its counterstrikes. The United States, having failed to impress the Houthis or deter them by launching major strikes against them a couple of days ago, 3 successive strikes against them, has now launched more strikes, 4 strikes, none of which look like they're achieving anything. There are more reports now that troops that Israel has withdrawn from Gaza are going to be redeployed to northern Israel, where they are apparently intended to take on the even more tough and well-trained and battle-hardened and well-organized force, which is Hezbollah. The situation, in other words, in the Middle East is continuing to deteriorate. But in order to do it proper justice, I'm going to have to discuss that in my next program. In the meantime, as I said, I end my video today with a deepening crisis in Germany, Russian advances on the battlefronts, reports of French mercenaries, if that's what they are, being killed in large numbers in Ukraine, and the neocons back on the attack over Ukraine in the United States, acting to block negotiations, to block any issue of peace, and in effect to prepare their alibi in case the war ends in disaster, which is that it's all down to a lack of Western will. So this is where I end my program today. So there'll be more from me soon, obviously. You can find all our programs on Locals, Rumble, and X, and other platforms. Don't forget also that you can check out our shop and buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts. There's a sale going on, 15% discount. When you go to our shop, you can find all the information about that. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And last but not least, don't forget, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.